Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kilic Kanat. I'm the research director at SETA Foundation. And welcome to our panel on Syria. And almost 12 years ago, when I started my career at SETA, my first panel was on Syria. And after long COVID and Zoom interregnum, now coming back to in-person panels, our first panel is once again in Syria. But of course, 12 years ago, there was a lot of disappointment. There was frustration that went on almost 11 years. And December 2024, things changed dramatically in a rather short period of time. And after 1 year, this January, we see again a significant change on the ground. And on that topic, we decided to bring together a panel, and we were fortunate to have probably the best panel in town on Syria. And we will have discussion on integration in Syria especially after the recent agreement. What does it mean? What will be the prospect for Syrians, stability for the people in Syria and for the region as well, and state authority. We have Charles Lester with us from Middle East Institute, Mona, Yacoubian, and we have been together in so many different panels, and of course, Ambassador James Jeffrey, together with our Kadir Ustun. And since we are 10 minutes late, I just want to start with Charles. Charles, can you set the ground for us, and can you tell us what happened in the last 1 year, and how do you see the prospect in Syria for its future?
What happened in the last year? A lot. But I suppose to try and concentrate it on the issues we're going to talk about, at least at the beginning of the conversation. Well, I mean, I would say the fall of Assad's regime, what was it, 14 months ago or so, was a sort of landmark moment, a transformative moment for Syria. Every calculation, every assumption that we had gamed into our analysis on Syria for nearly 14 years under Assad in civil conflict had to change fundamentally. And when it came to the conversation that triggered this panel, one of those assumptions that needed to change was the idea that separate entities elsewhere in Syria could remain viable as a third way. I wrote about this after my first visit to Syria. I think it was in January, and I wrote something in February saying that there needed to be a process to negotiate the integration of the SDF into the state. It wasn't sustainable to keep this kind of standoff and separate status. And that's basically what happened. I mean, by the following month, by March, we had the framework agreement announced, where the SDF's leader, Mazloum Abdi, was flown to Damascus, and he signed an agreement that was really just an agreement to agree that integration needed to happen. Of course, none of the details had been hashed out by that point. As a result of the March framework agreement, August was set as the initial deadline for those negotiations to be completed and integration to begin. Of course, August, that deadline passed, no agreement was made. October was the next deadline, October passed, no agreement was made. December was the final deadline, an ultimatum, frankly, both from Damascus and I understand from Turkey too, that by the end of the year, if this agreement hadn't been agreed and the details had not been finalized, there may be consequences. And so that's precisely what happened. I should say it was widely known, because all of these talks have been mediated by the United States and at times also by the French, was very well known that in around mid-October, there was a comprehensive agreement between the SDF and Damascus in front of the American and French mediators, where all of the core architecture of a deal that we saw publicly announced just a few weeks ago, before January 30th, the original one, had been agreed in October, but it was not publicly announced and it was not signed. And the perception in Damascus, the perception elsewhere, including, again, I have to emphasize, the perception here in the United States, in the State Department, in CENTCOM, and other parts of the government who have been involved in this, was that the SDF was struggling internally to commit to the core comprehensive deal that had been set out. And so, long story short, and there's lots of details that can be filled in here, is patience ran out. I met President Shara and his team in December, met the foreign minister and his team in December, and both of them separately, unprompted, said, Plan B, that's for them the military option. Plan B is back on the table now. And I remember saying to both of them separately, unprompted, I don't think that's a very good idea. You risk burning your relationships with the United States. You risk, inflaming tensions domestically within Syria, re-raising all the questions about inclusive governance and et cetera, et cetera. But their position was, we're only willing to allow, this is their words, not mine, we're only willing to allow the SDF to stall for so long. Something has to give. And something gave at the beginning of this year. First, clashes in eastern rural Aleppo on January 5th and January 6th, which then spread into Aleppo city. In fairly short order, 4 or 5 days, those Kurdish majority districts of the Aleppo city fell to government control. Compared to previous bouts of significant conflict elsewhere in Syria, very minimal casualties, very fast progress, and then a ceasefire was agreed. Again, I don't have the time to get into all of the small details, but fast forward a couple of weeks, we then saw a resumption of fighting spreading across the Euphrates, in part because of misinterpretations of wording, of timelines, of deadlines, and a complete lack of trust on both sides. In the space of 36 hours, the SDF lost about 70% of its fighting force through public defections, mostly by tribal forces. And in this same space of about 48 hours, they lost about 80% of their revenue generating assets, which predominantly oil, but also other areas, other assets. And that just crippled their long-term viability as an entity able to pay its own way, which basically pushed us into a place where we have the January 30th agreement. There's been lots of noise in Washington about Lindsey Graham's advocacy efforts. My understanding actually is that his efforts were impeding talks. President Trump, in fact, called Lindsey Graham to ask him to back off because it was complicating the negotiations on the table. So all sides are trying to sort of claim victory here, there, or everywhere. But long story short, we now have an agreement, and I'll let our panelists pick up here, but we have an agreement which I think, considering the still remaining very lack of trust on both sides, has proceeded quite smoothly. Now, there have been complications. Kobani has not moved in the same way that Kamishli and Hasakeh and other areas hoped to have. But even when there have been complications, both sides appear to have been thinking creatively about ways to build confidence. So suddenly we have this idea of joint checkpoints around Kobani to try and build confidence across both sides. And so far, that's worked too. So we've come full circle in many ways to I hope, much more hopeful place where integration can happen. And I'll end on one note of caution, which is when you look very specifically at language coming, I would say both sides, but particularly from elements within the SDF, the language around this agreement doesn't match the end point of how this agreement should look in 6 to 9 months' time. I still worry a bit that there are elements within the SDF who don't see this as a integration, let alone capitulation. And if and when we reach a point where that will have to be what it looks like, a full integration into the state and a submission of authority, then we find ourselves in a much more complicated and tense place. But we're not there yet. We are in an optimistic position, I think, certainly considering where we were.
Just a question about the wording. I will have a set of questions in the second round, but in terms of language, do you think it is a PR stunt by YPG and its elements, or do you think the leaders of the YPG really believes in those wording?
I think
because they have to save the face.
Yeah, I mean, let's put it really bluntly here. On December the 8th, 2024, Bashar al-Assad fell. Nobody expected that to happen. So that by itself was a shock. Within 24 hours, Ahmed al-Shara, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, had named himself, or essentially become, the de facto interim president of Syria. From the SDF's perspective, first you had a shock, then you had a massive sort of stab in the back. They've been at not just loggerheads, but at gunpoint for the last 10 plus years. It was a really hard and bitter pill to swallow. By February, March, when I wrote that first article, and then we had the framework agreement, it was already palpably clear, speaking to the White House, to the State Department, the intelligence community, and CENTCOM and SOCOM on the ground, that the calculation from the US government was, we now have a sovereign government that we can work with and achieve things that we could never have achieved with a non-state actor. So that's the third bitter pill to swallow, that all of a sudden the SDF had gone from being our most favored, loyal, dependable, and capable partner in the fight against a territorial ISIS state, to being this kind of potentially expendable partner that basically had to give up everything it had fought for and dissolve into the state under somebody they have zero respect for or trust in. So I think a lot of that is coming into play, that they are having to internally sell the idea that this is happening, but they're not going to say, well, the autonomous administration is dissolving into the state. They will say, well, the autonomous administration is remaining. But we might have a different flag over the top of the building. The practical reality here, though, is that whilst those staff and employees will be remaining in their jobs, they will be basically taking their instructions from Damascus.
Yeah.
That's where the difficulties will probably begin to emerge if these misinterpreted or different interpretations continue.
Thank you very much, Charles. Mona, your perspective.
Thank you so much for having me, Kilic, and it's a pleasure to be here at SETA again. Charles has given a very, very detailed laydown, and I wouldn't disagree with much of what Charles has said. I guess what I would really want to focus on, maybe a few things. One is just, I think we cannot overestimate just how significant the collapse of the Assad regime in December of 2024 was, in terms of, certainly, I would argue, reordering regional power dynamics. I'm sure Jim will get into that as well. But also the significance inside Syria. And I had the pleasure and opportunity to visit Damascus in November. And I do want to start by saying how struck I was by, with my colleague Will Todman, and how struck both of us were by this newfound freedom of expression. It was a very different Syria from the one that I certainly knew in the years prior. I was there as a student under Hafez al-Assad Syria. The sort of opening there was quite remarkable, the ability for people to say what they think, the fact that there wasn't mukhabarat on every street corner. However, what was also very apparent were the very real challenges that this transition, and it is still very much in transition, still faces. And I think in a way, Charles has sort of laid down the outlines of what's driving some of these tensions and challenges. And I will maybe just articulate a little bit further on that. Primarily, I think it is the fact that we cannot overlook just how diverse Syria's society is. And I think a critical challenge going forward remains how to ensure buy-in from various elements of Syrian society, certainly from minority groups like the Kurds and the Druze and the Alawites, but also even from Sunni communities, all of whom do not feel 100% included in this new transition government. That was one thing that struck me in Damascus, was this notion of an Idlibi core to the government, and a sense that they have ownership and others don't feel entirely included. The other point I would make is the dramatic shifts in power balances, and I don't think the SDF understood or fully appreciated the ways in which their power was vastly diminishing. So, and I would be curious, Charles and Jim, your thoughts on this. But this agreement, the March agreement, Charles, that you referenced, let's remember that agreement happened just on the heels of some fairly catastrophic clashes that took place on the coast, an Alawite-dominated coast, leading to 1,400 people killed, and by both sides an acknowledgement of atrocities being committed, sectarian violence. And I think the Kurds came to that agreement then feeling, in a funny sense, built up, feeling that they were in a moment of, frankly, their highest point of power, because they understood that the transition government is going to have a very difficult time selling the idea of integration if, in fact, there is worry and concern about the discipline of their own forces and about their ultimate intentions. And so I think that agreement was negotiated at a moment, arguably, I think in hindsight, at the height of power of the SDF. I don't think they fully understood as the transition government began to move forward and deepen its ability to sort of seat itself in Damascus. And the US, I think, also increasing its confidence in and its desire to see this transition government succeed. And I think that the highlight of that was President Trump's visit to the Middle East, in which he had his first face-to-face meeting with Ahmed al-Shara in May. And he voiced a desire for US sanctions to be lifted. And that was, of course, subsequently followed by an Oval Office visit with Ahmed al-Shara in November, and indeed the repeal of sanctions. So I think the US confidence, I don't think it happened all at once in January. I think it's happened over time. But again, we also had another episode of sectarian violence, this time in the south, in Sweda, with the Druze. Here again, questions were raised about what is the vision of the transition government? How will it attract minorities? And again, I think that the takeaway was other minorities are watching closely, and their confidence in this transition government and in its willingness to be inclusive is shaken when they see the kinds of the type of violence that took place in Soweto. Finally, though, I think where we are now, and I would agree with Charles's, guardedly optimistic view that we were talking in the green room prior. It's quite something that we haven't actually seen much more of a violence and more sort of contestation as this integration effort moves forward. And here I think it is really incumbent on the Kurdish forces to really understand their position and what needs to happen in order to be part of what I think everyone would agree needs to be a territorially coherent Syria under a transition government to which the Kurds are a part. They're not separate. And I think then, therefore, going forward, it is precisely these differences in interpretation that are going to potentially be problematic. But ultimately, I do think it is going to be incumbent on Kurdish elements to really acknowledge and acquiesce to the reality on the ground. I think Charles rightly points out the percentage of land assets, the Arab forces that essentially melted out of the SDF. This is a new reality. And I think for Syria to move forward, it is going to be incumbent on the Kurds to find creative ways to work with the transition government. Last point, however, just as the Kurds, I think, really did have a bit of overreach and not understanding the power imbalances, the transition government also is vulnerable to overreach and to not accurately assessing what it takes to ensure buy-in from various groups. And so I think it's going to be equally important that the transition government take on board and think through creatively what is the way to make this work. Because if it works with the Kurds, that will have enormously positive repercussions with other minority groups. And by the same token, if it doesn't work with the Kurds, and if somehow this is derailed, not only would the transition government potentially face a Kurdish insurgency of sorts that could be extremely destabilizing. It will also send all the wrong signals to other groups whose buy-in and whose vision for a new Syria is one that is reflected in this transition government. I'll stop there.
Mona, just a question. In the midst of this, President Shara announced a presidential decree granting citizenship rights to Kurds and several other rights. Do you think it would play a positive role? Because it was somehow disappeared in the fog of war.
No, I think it is. I think it's a very positive signal. I think it is exactly an effort to underscore the ways in which Kurds are welcome and considered part and parcel of Syria. I think the concerns are how durable is that, because it's a presidential decree. It's not enshrined in the Constitution. To what extent could it be withdrawn if somehow, some way, the Kurds aren't playing ball? So I think it's a very important confidence building measure, but I would argue in order to have the full force of, I hope, its intention, it would eventually be enshrined in the Constitution, and this would be part and parcel of this vision. If I could say, your question, Kilic, really reminds me, Ahmed Shara has had an incredible run. I mean, he has done a lot to garner international credibility, to his great credit. And he's moved the ball forward internally as well. But one thing that he has not really done, I don't think, is convey, as the transitional president of Syria, a vision that all Syrians can understand and buy into, that is the vision of what Syria can and should be. What is this new Syria? And he's an incredible speaker. And actually, one of the takeaways from our trip is, why isn't he out there more? Why isn't he doing more national addresses? Someone we spoke to when I was in Damascus said it would be great if he did Zelensky-style addresses to the Syrian people. In other words, he spent a lot of time communicating externally and done it quite well, but it would be really important for this project to succeed if he does more of that kind of communication internally.
Ambassador?
Now we go. Green, not red. Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me today. Let me start with how I ran through the news yesterday and this morning, which I have to do with my job in the Middle East. Bang, the first thing is I see a picture of Erdogan flanked by the two leaders of the Dems party meeting together in his office. Now, Erdogan didn't look all that happy. The point is the meeting just happened. And that was following yesterday. Erdogan gave a message to his Syrian people talking about, among other things, how he wants to see smiles in the cities across Syria. And he named 7 cities. And 3 of them were Kurdish: Qamishli, Hasaka, and Kobani. I was reading in English and it was written Kobani. I said, that's the translation, because I know how the Turks refer to Kobani. I know Arab. I then looked and found the Turkish version, at least Anadolu agencies, and it was Kobani. And I said, something's going on here. Then I saw that Trump was moving another aircraft carrier into the region, and while also telling Bibi, we're going to go on with the negotiations on nuclear stuff, while Egypt and other countries are announcing they're moving forward and training 10,000 folks for the Gaza Phase 2 security force, but no Hamas people. Okay, I could go on. The point is, we are facing not only a dramatically different Syria, but a dramatically different Middle East, and the two are much associated with each other. Without the fall of Assad and so far the relative success of the successor government, we would not be in the situation regionally that amounts to, and boy, in my many years dealing with the Middle East since, well, actually the first time, Yom Kippur, I did use this word, but since then I haven't, and that is victory. And this victory can be lost over time, as we saw after Yom Kippur, as we saw after the Kuwait liberation, but it's off to a pretty good start region-wide. Nonetheless, of the three big issues, Syria is the most important, the most critical, and the most likely to fail. Trust me, Trump will get some kind of deal with the Iranians on nuclear, that he will declare a victory, and for the moment we'll deal with the nuclear program, most of which is, of course, still buried. I've been working with the Israelis for a long time on phase two, essentially the phase two plan of Trump's. When pitched to the Israelis a year and a half, 2 years ago, the answer was, look, in the end, we know this is what we're going to have to do, but we won't do it or initiate it. The U.S. has to push it on us. Well, that's exactly what's happening. So that leaves Syria as the one element that has to be gotten right for this beautiful trend to continue. I'm beginning to talk like the Trump administration. And there are three problems. Okay, let's start with the situation with the SDF. I don't know what we're going to call it, YPG, PYD, Danes, but I like SDF. I'm used to it, so we're going to stick with the SDF. It also underlines it's still an army. 4 brigades, but brigades are, to me, of many sizes. One reason that the events Charles described happened, I believe, is that unlike too big to fail, the SDF was too big to succeed. That is, it had too much of Syria. It occupied 30% of the territory, almost all of the oil fields, much of the arable land, and 2 largely Arab provinces whose population before the fighting, before the Civil War, was almost 2 million. And it had a, how shall I say, hostile relationship, not actively hostile, but tense, dangerous, long-term problem with its neighbor to the north, Turkey. Now, I was involved in much of the dealings over 20 years with the somewhat analogous Kurdistan regional government in Iraq. And they didn't have these 3 problems. They didn't control most of the country's oil supplies. They didn't sit on top of 2 million Arabs. And they had friendly relations with Ankara as opposed to difficult ones. And they still, they were small enough to succeed. And they did. The Druze, for the moment, are small enough to succeed too. The Syrian Kurdistan of yesterday was too big to succeed, because if it succeeded, then the whole Syrian experience would fail. And among the many things, that gets to Al-Tanf. Al-Tanf was never a de-ISIS mission. It was a camouflage de-ISIS mission. It was a de-Iran mission. And that's what the Syrian government can do. People underestimate the huge role the SDF played just by occupying terrain and helping us beat back occasional Assad, Iranian, and don't forget the Wagner Brigade attacks. But it can't, in its own area, stop Syria from becoming another base for Iran. Only Damascus can, and that's critical to the United States. Okay, so 3 ways this thing can fail. 1, the international community loses its unanimity. That's so important. A crappy policy towards Syria that everybody in the international community, Arab states, Israel, Turkey, us, UN and such, more or less follows, is better than 3 brilliant policies that are colliding with each other, which was much of what we had during the Civil War. Watch that spot. But the thing to notice is, forget about the national security strategy and the pivot. I hate that word, the shift to Asia. These guys are all over the Middle East, be it Tom Barrack, be it Witkoff, be it Jared, be it business people, and be it aircraft carriers. Look at them. I've never seen us more active. I've certainly never seen us more active and more successful. But anyway, so that's how we'll take care of the first problem, I hope. The second problem, and it's the most immediate one, is the situation with the SDF. It's now small enough to succeed, and it has to succeed. This agreement, the 29th, has to succeed. What does that mean? First and foremost, U.S. troops have to stay on. I was happy they were being pulled out of Al-Tanf, because I think that may satiate the demands to, let's withdraw troops that we have back here so that they can stay on and monitor and support this transition. And it's just it goes better with U.S. troops on the ground. Secondly, we need whatever's left of the siege of Kobani to end. We need humanitarian transfers from Iraq to Hasaka to continue. And we need all elements of the announcement by the president. What is it? Decree number 13. It was now memorialized in the 29 January statement to be carried out in these areas. There are examples in the Middle East. I cite the non-Kurdish governorates of Iraq and Article 122 and 123 of the Iraqi Constitution that grants them pretty broad self-government rights, including own police, elected governors, and such. That's a good model, not just for the Kurdish areas, but for all of Syria. Because if Damascus and the Kurds get that region right, then they'll be able to eventually integrate the other problem, major problem, which is the Druze in the south and calm Israel. And then the third issue, of course, is the overall ability of the al-Shara government to govern the country as a whole, not just the specific minorities, although that's critically important for the moment, but just economic, political governance, reining in their own militaries and such. It's a big job ahead, but I'm optimistic.
Ambassador, you were at Congress in a hearing on Tuesday, and after that there were a lot of discussions. Let me paraphrase this way. Those who are not happy about what's happening in the region, right, in Syria right now, expect a potential policy change after, if there is a change in Congress after November, or after 2-3 years. Do you expect that, or do you think it is over now?
No, because much of the opposition to the administration's policy, at least in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, came from Republican members of the House. And they were concerned. No, I think that, again, if Syria gets the situation halfway right, and while I had been somewhat like Charles, pushing my friends in the SDF to make concessions because of they're too big to succeed under these circumstances analysis. They're now small enough to succeed. They have to succeed. Shara now can make concessions to them. And so I think that if he does so, that will calm those voices that I listened to for hours on Tuesday.
Thanks a lot. Kadir.
Thank you very much. Much has been said, of course, about the SDF situation. I want to just highlight a couple things. This agreement, I agree, is very crucial for territorial integrity of Syria, among other things, assuaging Turkish concerns. Turkey's policy has been relatively stable, and what they wanted to see about the SDF, they laid it out relatively clearly. They were consistent about it, how they communicated that to the US. And I'm trying to avoid delving into the history, how we got here. But I just wanted to highlight one Turkish argument that was basically, you can't really do the ISIS fight with PKK in the medium and long run. The US has insisted, but also once ISIS was largely defeated, it had a hard time defining a new mission for the SDF. And like Ambassador said, SDF was holding a lot of territory, filled with a lot of Arab constituency, and and if anybody knows PKK's history, we were talking about it in my office earlier, that they particularly go after other Kurdish groups. They did that for years in Turkey because they want to monopolize whatever the Kurdish power, strength, etc. is. Of course, Turkey's policy in Idlib, in northeast, has been to argue that basically Syrian Kurds are fine. They should be here. They should be involved in running their local governance, etc. But you cannot have the guys sent from the Kandil Mountains running the show and be in charge. And that's what was happening with SDF for a long time. Anyway, so now there is an integration agreement, and let's also mention that part of the reason they were forced to accept this agreement is that Turkey was also internally running its own process that led to Erdogan HDP meeting, or the Kurdish parties meeting. There's an ongoing process internally. Turkey is trying to also resolve this issue once and for all, ending PKK threat to Turkish national security. So Turkey never saw it as a separate issue in the Northeast, this SDF. It saw it directly impacting its own national security. And one of the things that turned out to be true is, PKK from the Turkish perspective was basically, blackmailing the Western community with the US also, that we are the only ones who can hold ISIS. And then we saw them releasing those Daesh fighters, as a way to show, hey, if we're not in charge here, you're gonna have a lot of ISIS fighters running around, and that needs to be underlined. That kind of approach they had, blackmailing in return they expected support and got support, but they weren't able to do things without the US support. That was clear. US air cover, US presence on the ground, but of course Trump's policy has made it impossible for them to maintain that outlook and presence. So one thing in this most recent, Mona mentioned that, the Latakia, there were incidents there, that Sueda, there were ethnic clashes, relatively short-lived, relatively, but of course, things seriously to be concerned about. We thought, a lot of experts thought similar things would happen in Aleppo, maybe even much worse, because you had YPG fighters, SDF fighters, armed and etc. And we saw them being much more careful. We didn't see huge clashes like that in Aleppo. That's I guess, that hope for the future as well. So Syria, three main challenges, not the only ones, of course, were the sanctions, PKK, territorial integrity of Turkey, and also Israel's policy. Early on, remember how Israel was involved in hitting Damascus, and they've, with Trump's involvement, Trump's mediation, I guess, their concerns are relatively addressed to some extent. There is coordination, there's been meetings. So like Mona said, we need to credit Shara about his political approach and diplomatic skills to gain acceptance externally. And that helped a lot, I think, in basically preventing Israel from trying to, quote unquote, ensure its own security by itself, rather giving this government a chance. With the sanctions, they've been removed. That's a very good development. But the current problem is also financing. Like MasterCard and Visa, those they're still not active. It's not working. You can't quite, I think, wire money, and you can't. So for investment and development to happen, things have to move on that front. There's still a lot of hesitancy on the part of the financial community, banks, etc., to take a bolder approach. And you mentioned in your testimony, Ambassador, U.S. embassy being opened there would be very crucial, along with other Western embassies must be opened. I think there's Turkey, Italy, Spain, full on running embassies. I'm not sure if there are others, Charles, maybe you can. But if the US is there and then other Western governments are there, that's going to give a lot of reassurance, I think, to a lot of financiers or development work that has to go on. And I think that will help a lot with the stability of the government in Damascus. One last thing, I guess, I want to say is, he's reportedly survived quite a few attempts on his life, and it's hard. I don't want to imagine a scenario where that succeeds, because that would be a really big chance lost for Syria's future. I think I understand, Mona, what you're saying. There needs to be a vision. A lot of groups have to be brought around the table, and it's true that needs to happen. And they also need technical support. Your bureaucracy needs to be rebuilt. I mean, Kilic and I were there early last year, quite early, and devastation is just impossible to describe, basically. A lot of work needs to be done, but since the expectations are so low, if there's some serious projects going on, airports, roads, and etc., there's some money coming in, international finance, etc., that will go a long way, I think. And there is an opportunity right now. There is hope right now. And I'm emphasizing this also because, Kilic, we had so many panels here that we ended with such, dark kind of outlook for Syria. So it's a big contrast. For going forward, I think there is momentum, and the international community can do a lot in terms of supporting the transition.
Go ahead.
Risking getting invited back here. Okay, we're going to go with this, at least I will, for one last 300th time. One, if the terrorist organization is the PKK offshoot, the SDF, trust me, you can effectively fight terrorists with terrorists, because they were brilliant in the fight up until the destruction of the last of the Islamic State in Baghouz. I want to underline that. I'll get to their mixed record as a counterinsurgency force afterwards, but you certainly can. And when people ask me that, that was never what the Turks said. They never said, even because they knew they had U.S. support. Of course, the Peshmerga had U.S. support. The Iraqi army had U.S. support. Nobody was doing all that well against them without U.S. support. Now, our Turkish support, for example, in Euphrates Spring, because the Turks did a good job against ISIS as well. But my response was also, wait a second, unlike the SDF, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is designated by the UN, designated by Turkey, designated by the US as a terrorist organization, yet you are effectively fighting what we consider a terrorist state on the terrorist list, Assad, with your quasi-allies, HTS. What's the difference? My answer I got 300 times from Ankara was, let's talk about your wrong F-35 policy. So I want to make this point clear. We were doing nothing wrong. There was nobody else who could have taken that mission on. Now, the problem was that after the defeat of the Islamic State as a state, the SDF was not the answer to eliminating ISIS remnants in Iraq and Syria, because it was only controlling a small part, 30% of Syria, and it was in a counterinsurgency in the Arab areas, and there the record was mixed. They were a good counterinsurgency force, but in part because part of the Arab population was unhappy with them, they couldn't eliminate that counterinsurgency. The Arabs, however, stayed generally with the SDF because the alternative was Assad, Iranians, ISIS, and they preferred the SDF. As soon as you got a real government there in Damascus, things changed, and that's where we are now.
Okay, just
one
before I
thing.
collect questions. Yes.
Turkey, as you know, ambassador, suggested which groups to support. There were a lot of groups, and perhaps without this has been the American argument that PKK was the only one. PKK was the most coherent, unified, I agree, and they were effective with US support. But Turkey did present alternatives, and I was describing Turkey's position. I wasn't saying this is 100%.
I know, but we went through it in the general staff in Washington. We went through that in January of 2019 in great detail because Trump loved the idea when President Erdogan proposed it. And we sat down with the Turkish General Staff to talk about this. And I believe the number of U.S. support troops they needed if they wanted to go down the Euphrates was 5,000. But the whole idea was we were looking for somebody to replace us on the ground, not to ask us to reinforce. There was no other force that could deal with the Islamic State in northeast Syria. Just like there was no other force that could deal in the Kurdish areas of Iraq than the Peshmerga.
Thank you. And I will start collecting some questions, but while you are preparing your questions, I have some my own questions to the panel. Charles, talking about tribes. So we are talking about that tribes played a significant role. They were partly the game changers when they flipped and changed their position. And right now, who speaks for those? And what are their expectations from the regime? And what kind of challenges Shara may have in terms of integrating tribes to Damascus?
So this is a great question. I'd love to come back to the ISIS issue just because I think it is key as we look forward now, because that's kind of the key question when we're looking at US drawdown. But I'll tackle your question first. The tribes have been and continue to be a massive conundrum for Damascus. Throughout the nearly 14 years of Syria's civil conflict, I think tribes were often played down in significance. You know, you had the armed opposition groups, which spanned across tribes, but not around. You had the SDF, which co-opted some tribes, but also split tribes. So you didn't have what we saw, for example, and I will come to explain how this was such a terrible development, but we didn't have what we saw in July this past year in 2025 when we had the Syria's National Tribal Confederation launched a general mobilization. Nothing like that happened in nearly 14 years of Syria's civil conflict, where suddenly the tribes played their card. And we saw the consequences of it. No question that government forces were culpable for crimes in Sweden, no question about it. But when Syrian Ministry of Defense did pull out and the tribes went in, things got a lot and even more messy and chaotic and bloody than they were before. And I was in Damascus a few weeks after the Sweden violence, purely coincidentally, and it was absolutely clear in meetings with the Interior Minister, the Foreign Minister, with the Presidency, with the General Intelligence Directorate, it was palpably clear that this had been a major wake-up call, that the tribes were not something that the government were able to control. And when the tribes felt like they were being stepped on, as they did in Sweden with the Bedouins being displaced from their perspective, they mobilized and they took action. And the government proved itself incapable of pulling them out until that US, Jordanian, Syrian mediated agreement in July. So that was at that point where we suddenly saw, and not to get too deep in the weeds here, but where we suddenly saw one of Ahmed al-Shara's most bitter former friends, then kind of almost rival, Abu Ahmed Zakor, suddenly being publicly announced as Syria's tribal emissary, the president's basically envoy to the tribes. And Abu Ahmed Zakor then spent from about mid-August through to the end of the year, he was traveling throughout Syria almost daily, 7 days a week, meeting with tribal leaders, constantly, quietly. Every now and then there were photographs, but it was an intensive tribal engagement effort. And I think we started to see the results of that, in part because, yes, the tribes flipped overnight in SDF-held areas and completely changed the game. But what we also saw was, yes, there have been a number of 2 or 3 documented incidents of very significant, grim, bloody executions and crimes in the Northeast, recent Northeast violence. And so far as I'm aware, in terms of extrajudicial executions of individuals, those have the ones that have been publicly documented were committed by tribal fighters. So there is still a problem. One set up a pop-up checkpoint on a highway and killed a Kurdish family, for example. And so it's still an issue, but they didn't run rampage like they did in Sweden. So there's been progress, at least, in terms of pulling them under. But, and here's the big but, as we see this integration agreement hopefully continue to proceed, long-standing tribal demands are going to start to become big, thorny issues. I mean, one of them, nearly 900 Arab men were arrested by the SDF over the last year for posting on Facebook or in support of Damascus or having photographs of President al-Shara on their cell phone. The whereabouts of almost all of those men is still unknown. So if they are found in detention, great, they'll get released, but then tribes will expect some kind of a recompense. If some of them are not found alive in detention somewhere, there will be worse consequences. And there are a number of other, examples I can string out to say those unresolved tensions and issues are going to become issues as this integration agreement unfolds. So basically, I think we've seen progress, but not nearly enough, and there are going to be big question marks. And just really quickly on the ISIS issue, I think Ambassador Jeffrey hit the nail on the head. The SDF proved as capable as any actor could have been in terms of rolling back territorial control by ISIS with very strong US support. Once that mission switched to a counterinsurgency in which obviously they weren't countering an ISIS insurgency in Kurdish majority areas, they were going to be tackling a threat that was embedded within Arab regions of SDF control. The value of the SDF began to decrease. It took quite some time when you look at all of the data. It took quite some time for us to see the results of that. In 2024, ISIS completed its first full year of month-on-month resurgence in Syria, statistically. 2/3 of the data that amounts to that resurgence was in SDF-held areas of Syria. So prior to Assad's fall, and I know this for a fact because I was in some of these meetings and workshops, all the alarm bells were ringing within CENTCOM about where ISIS was headed. They were taking advantage of the regime's inability to control the central desert, but they were resurgent in SDF areas. What we have seen, and this is in flux because Syria is in flux, but what we have seen since Assad's fall is ISIS attacks have halved, literally halved, and I have all the data for this. Not only have ISIS attacks all across Syria halved, but the potency, the fatalities resulting from ISIS attacks are down by 76%. So ISIS has had a massive shock to the system from Assad's fall and the fallout from that. Now, it's really, really early days. This will not remain such a big number, what I'm about to say. But since the SDF integration agreement was announced, ISIS attacks all across Syria have dropped 90% from where they were 3 weeks ago. So short term, bump along the road, it's not going to mean ISIS attacks remain 90% down. But again, it shows a massive shock to their system. Why? Because they depended on those Arab tensions within SDF-held areas to maintain their attacks. And the results of that are equally clear. 89% of ISIS attacks last year were in SDF-held areas of Syria. So they depended upon those tensions to continue to recruit on a low level and to justify locally their existence and their attacks. That's now gone. So I think they will unquestionably turn their target on Damascus, but that's a much harder challenge to present.
Ambassador, Charles was mentioning CENTCOM, comparing to 2019, and that there was this perception that CENTCOM was more supportive to SDF. What do you think changed in 2026?
Well, the whole situation in Syria changed. Also, it took a little time. You got the administration to exercise more control over CENTCOM. It also, to some degree, was commander specific. But I'm going to go back. Forgive me, but you raised it. It's just
While
it's
this
important.
heated debate is taking place, if you have a question, please
Right.
raise
No,
your-
but it's important. CENTCOM was our biggest problem. They were extremely successful in our Syria policy. They were also our biggest problem because of the tension with Turkey. And CENTCOM did things. Why did they decide to start arming the SDF after Raqqa fell? If they had managed to fight these guys successfully for 3 years, why do we have to start provoking Turkey by giving them weapons in early 2018? Why did we put those 3 outposts on the Turkish border? Why did we issue a de-ISIS coalition statement without getting Turkey a member to clear on it that SDF would transition to a border defense force of 150,000 with the priority on the northern border. Duh, who's on the northern border of Syria? But I'm going to defend CENTCOM now, because every time CENTCOM sat down with their Turkish counterparts, they heard two things. The first, which is wrong, is you can't fight terrorists with other terrorists, yet CENTCOM was doing it every day. But the second thing, which was worse, was, and you're not really in northern Syria to fight ISIS, you're really there to weaken Turkey. They heard that all the time from their NATO allied generals. This made it extremely difficult for me or other American diplomats to roll in and say, hey, CENTCOM, you need to be more sensitive to Turkey. And they would simply say, Turkey, listen what these guys are saying. If the Turkish message had been, and I begged everybody short of Erdogan to say this, and they never did, CENTCOM, look, obviously the SDF is an effective force against ISIS, but it comes with baggage with us. They are PKK offshoots, so we're extremely sensitive. So we beg you and urge you, be careful. Don't listen to everything they ask. Don't, when they say we want to go across the Euphrates, to cut routes to Raqqa, look at what their own agenda is. Please, CENTCOM. They could not, the Turks could not get that message to CENTCOM because they started every meeting with, you can't fight terrorists with terrorists, and you're not really there to fight terrorists anyway, you're there to weaken us in Ankara. That was a message CENTCOM got for years. And thus, they didn't listen to Turkey, and they barely listened at times to me. I'm pretty unhappy about this because we succeeded in the end despite this, but this was not the best day for CENTCOM, and it wasn't the best day for the Turkish government dealing with us in CENTCOM.
Yeah, I'm not going to wade quite into the debate, but I do actually want to make 2 points on the ISIS threat and counter ISIS, one looking backward and one looking forward. On the looking backward, and I think both Charles and Jim laid down well kind of the landscape of our U.S. reliance on the SDF. I think the one data point that we didn't mention, and I think it bears mentioning because it does have something to do with how CENTCOM viewed the SDF, is that in the active campaign to defeat ISIS, the SDF took some 10,000 casualties in Syria. While in the active campaign, you could count on one hand how many Americans were killed. And I think that is an enormous testament to the SDF's willingness and as a partner. And I think it speaks to the depth of emotional ties that CENTCOM had, for better or worse. It doesn't mean that some of these miscalculations, I think, Charles, your data is very compelling about the diminishing utility over time, the erosion of legitimacy, et cetera, because of the way perhaps the SDF undertook governance. So I'm not taking away from that, but I do think that data point is extremely important to understand. That's the backward. The forward, and it's almost as much a question and as much really for Charles, is the UN, I think, just came out with a report about, 5 or so assassination attempts on Ahmed Ashara and those close to him, presumably under ISIS auspices. And one of the factors that I thought was very interesting in my very brief trip to Damascus is this dynamic that Ahmed Ashara is in the midst of, which is the extent to which he makes approaches toward the West. And I was there the day that Ahmed Ashara is in the Oval Office here. And it was portrayed somewhat as a liability to Shara amongst his, I would call it, right flank elements, former HTS elements who are more extreme in their ideology, more extreme in their views. And that this creates a dynamic of disaffection and movement toward, if not ISIS, their own, I can't recall the group, Charles, you'll know it, that claimed responsibility for the suicide bombing in the church. We do have this continuing dynamic that I think Ahmed Ashara has to contend with, and it's a difficult one, that the extent to which he moderates, the extent to which he includes others, that can be actually a turnoff to those that are more to the right of him, that have more staunch Salafi views, and that actually can create new centers of opposition to him that could be, I'm not going to say they'll become a new form of ISIS, but it is a type of threat, I think, that is very real.
Now you got me onto a subject which I find just personally quite fascinating, because it hasn't started after Assad's fall, this reality. You know, Ahmed al-Shara has faced internal death threats, assassination plots. In Syria, the first one I'm aware of was in 2013 from within their own ranks. You know, I've written about this at length over many, many years, but from both Al-Qaeda internally, when they tried to unseat him in 2013, through to ISIS once it had become a very real reality. And throughout all of those many, many years, he dealt with the problem basically in the same way. And we'll see a different variation of it now that he's a president and not you know, a militia commander. In the years past, people were quietly killed off. I mean, he was ruthless about it. From 2019 until Assad's fall, I think it's fairly well established now that at times when he had problematic elements, they suddenly ended up being killed in American drone strikes. And you can, you know, +1+1=2, figure out how that happened. And again, written about these things. I mean, you know, one individual comes out in public with a video pronouncing takfir on Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, and 3 weeks later he's killed in a US drone strike. You know, I mean, no coincidence when you trace back all the tiny fine details. Since he became transitional president, interim president, it's obviously not been undertaken in the same ruthless ways. But many of the individuals who were initially promoted into senior positions in the Ministry of Defense, including several non-Syrians, which then became quite a big public issue, were very quietly sidelined and are no longer in positions of command. But there was no noise about it. There was no public announcement that would have caused humiliation. People were slowly moved out of positions of authority. And there has been a constant process like this on the provincial level and the national level. As some of these voices have become more problematic, they are slowly and subtly moved away, so they don't become a problem. The only other thing I would say here is as an anecdote, because I asked a question similar to that to the Interior Minister, whose job it is to prevent all of these challenges. And frankly, he was the implementer of all of that more ruthless history I just described. So he's really quite an expert at kind of counterintelligence stuff. His response was that joining the counter-ISIS coalition more than the Oval Office meeting was going to be the issue that was going to become a problem. And he said, and I hope I'm sort of not betraying too much of his trust here, and I'll try and remain a little bit more vague. He said, you know, it's not so much that we're now concerned that those threats will now come from within our own ranks. They will come from the 2,000 or 3,000 men in the Northwest who have consistently refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of our government. They are not within the MOD, they're not within the MOI, they are just in northwestern Syria. And he said, if there was one benefit from joining the coalition as a sovereign government, it's that we now have American friends to help us with these problems. And I personally think that's a little naive. I think it's going to be more difficult than that. But it gives you a window into how they're thinking this through. Now that we're a sovereign, recognized, legitimate government with America by our side, and by the way, US intelligence is basically full-time in Damascus, sharing intel with the Syrian Ministry of Interior on ISIS, Iran, and all manner of other things. So this is a very hand-in-hand relationship. They believe that that transforms their ability to be able to more strategically deal with some of these challenges.
Sorry, very quick. I just have
Okay,
to respond
just go
to just your point on joining the global coalition. Absolutely, that's right, correct. The one data point that I forgot to mention, and nor did you, but I think is significant, is of course the attack in December that killed 2 US military personnel and a civilian interpreter. That was undertaken, and again, to the credit of the government, the transition government, by a supposedly new recruit to the security forces who clearly had ISIS sympathies. And so, by the way, that, Jim, is why I think it's going to be even less likely, as much as I agree with you that we should absolutely reopen the embassy in Damascus. That attack, I think, just set that quest back further. And so I think that is a very potent data point as to just how significant this challenge is. And ironically, it makes it even harder for Americans to work closely when that threat is out there and there's no clear sense of just how well this current transition government can mitigate it.
Thank you very much. And I'll open the floor for questions after these passionate conversations. We have been having these conversations, especially with Ambassador Jeffrey, for more than 10 years right now. So especially for Turkey's realities. Yeah, it is, as you can see, at least the problem is more or less over, but it's important, of course, for Turkey as well to deal with a group that has been fighting against Turkey for 30, 40 years. I think the emotions were on both sides. And given the fact that nothing hurt American image in Turkey probably more than US support to YPG over there, there's also public dimension of this. Let's start with Ijlal and collect the questions. We have 10 minutes.
Thank you. I want to switch to Israel's role. Charles, you said that President Trump personally called Lindsey Graham to ask him to back off because his actions, were complicating the negotiations in Syria. Could you elaborate on this, and to what extent Lindsey Graham's actions were influenced by Israel? And in general, other panelists also might want to answer. What can you say about Israel's actions in Syria? Do you see it as a complicating or challenging factor for efforts to achieve a unified and stable Syria?
If you can add the Paris meeting. So after Paris meeting, there was always this debate that because the Aleppo operation happened after that, there is what is your take about that?
That's a good one, but you'll send me down a rabbit hole. But I'll start specifically on your question. I can't say much more on the Lindsey Graham front, other than that I know the president had a conversation with him, and a few hours later, Lindsey Graham posted a thing on Twitter or X, whatever, where he was basically backing off from the whole effort. That was as a result of a call from the president, who said your efforts are basically impeding the track of negotiations, which may or may not break down at any point. The only other thing to bear in mind is that from the perspective of the Senate, the legislation has no legs to stand on. In fact, the quote that I got from the most senior person on the Senate, that I know at least, was, it doesn't only have no legs, it has not even a toe to stand on. The second it was introduced, we'd veto it. And so it created a lot of noise, but I worry a little bit that a lot of that noise actually overfed confidence on one side, frustrated and angered the other side, and affected the way that those negotiations went before January the 29th, when there was this big US push to push them across the table. But on the wider issue of Israel, I mean, I think, we don't have the time to get into all the weeds about Israel's perspective of the transition. All I will say is the January the 6th talks in Paris seem to have been, compared to everything else preceding it, a great success. Both sides came out publicly and said that they were very constructive. And again, as somebody who tracks, every single violent incident all across Syria, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, the rate of Israeli military actions in Syria halved after January the 6th, and it has remained at half that level. And so that, just as a concrete metric, shows very clearly not that they have stopped, but that they took a decision. That consistent halving can only have happened because a decision was made to ease pressure on Syria. And as I understand it, the Israelis are now toying with the idea of starting to do what the US did in April 2025, which was starting to give intelligence packages to Damascus and testing their willingness and ability to go after those specific threats. That was what gave the US confidence to basically work directly with the MOI and general intelligence, and the Israelis are being encouraged to try the same model. And so there's still plenty of difficulties, but we're in a much better place over the last couple of months than where we were throughout 2025. And I point you to, and I can't remember where it was written, in one of Israel's major newspapers published an article by the just recently, not retired, but he just recently stopped being Israel's national security advisor. I've forgotten his name now. Hanegbi. Yeah, and he wrote this fascinating op-ed where he said, for Israel, 2026 is going to be the year of Syria. Now, for lots of pessimists, you would have thought that meant they were about to launch a war on Syria. His argument was the opposite. He had led the negotiations with the Syrians when they were bad in 2025, or we were in a worse place. And he said he was, and I can't remember the exact quote, something like remarkably impressed by the potential of a Syrian-Israeli relationship, and that Netanyahu must be convinced to take the brave steps and move forward. And we know that President Trump is saying precisely the same thing. I understand it was said again yesterday, that you have to move forward on this, take the gamble and see where it goes. And I think once that happens, if it does, then SETA, as this other outstanding issue, will then become much more easy to potentially resolve. But we don't have the time to get into SETA today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for all the panelists, really. We are talking about integration now. So we are talking integration on the level of the military and security. What about the integration among the societies in Syria? That is most important now. The other thing, how can we rebuild the trust among the Syrian societies, especially with the groups that experience displaced violence till now? It's so important, you know. We have a lot of many examples about that. I would like to ask Mr. Kadir, you are always talking about the PKK and the problem with the Syrian and the SDF related to that. I don't know how can we overcome and solve this problem. It has been more than 40 years, still there is a challenge. So I think with Mr. Ambassador, he mentioned that President Erdogan, he was meeting with the DEM party. So there is some process going on. So we need to solve this problem in Turkey so that we in Syria also we having at least some peace. We don't want to have involved in the other thing, which is over, across the border. So that's what we want. As a Syrian people, we, as a Kurdish also, we want to have it. So, live in peace as a Kurdish people. I am from Afrin. Another question. What is the future of Afrin now under the Turkish occupation? Still, we can see the Turkish language there. Still, we see the Turkish flag there. So what is the future of Afrin now? Thank you so much.
Well,
If you have any other questions, let's collect them before. Yeah.
Thanks. Follow up for you, Ambassador, and you too, Charles. Now that I was reading just this morning that it looks like the number of detainees that were moved into Iraq has been completed. Now, and I've heard this from you, Charles, in previous events that you've done at MII, that the detainee issue is basically the main reason why U.S. forces are still in the East. Now we just got out of TANF. Now, what would the implications be potentially if tomorrow's it's announced that all U.S. forces in the one base we have is gone?
Okay, let's start with Kadir.
In my initial remarks that triggered Ambassador's response, maybe I couldn't explain it that well. I didn't want to go into history for a reason, but what I was saying is that anti-ISIS mission, after that, it was difficult to define a mission for YPG. We saw Pompeo's, for instance, list of things that they could accomplish, like keeping Russia out, keeping Iran out, etc. So Turkey's pickle with this whole relationship with the YPG especially was that basically they're trying to accomplish a political mission with your military support, logistical support. That is a problem for us. That is not realistic for Syria either. These are Syrian, Sunni majority places you're going into. Panel described that really well. So the core of the Turkish argument, whether they relate it well to CENTCOM is a different story. I think the problem for CENTCOM was more structural, which was they were given this mission to fight ISIS without US boots on the ground. So they kept focusing on their mission, and they kept saying, look, ISIS is not over. And if you want me to finish them off, I'm going to have to continue this mission. But the geopolitical developments in the region, many things happened. I don't want to go into all the details, but at the end we had Assad regime fall, HTS took over, and then, we have the whole 14-month period now. Many things happened, but the initial argument, Turkish argument, I was trying to say that actually played itself out. And the fact that PKK, YPG forces that were the backbone of SDF, them playing these games about, releasing ISIS prisoners, etc., again, were confirming the Turkish position. And remember, Turkey didn't rush into, oh, Assad fell, let's go into the north and fight the PKK even harder. They never stopped hitting their, ammunition wherever they could. Just because Americans were there, Turkey didn't say, okay, we'll just wait until one day when we can. No, they operated on the ground. Remember, major concerns were security, preventing inflows of further refugees, and it succeeded. Turkey took big risks. They were hit by Russia. They lost many soldiers, many more than Americans. So they were heavily invested, and they remain invested in Syria's future. But now, if this transition government, if you have a new political environment where, let's not also forget, Assad regime relied ethnically, whatever, on a very minority power. And so now we are seeing the flip of that. Right now, the majority is trying to take power, but they must include the minorities. You all know the large, different minority groups, both ethnically and religiously. So if this project hopefully succeeds, then we will be able to talk about true stability in the region, which, then Syria won't be a source of problem for Israel or Turkey or other regional powers. That's the perspective that Ankara has. Of course, internally, efforts to reach a settlement internally with Kurdish question never stopped. There's been more than a dozen attempts. This is just the latest attempt. From the Turkish perspective, Kurdish people must be able to live in a democratic environment, have their, rights like every other citizen, and they have the same vision for Syria. But of course, they can't go in and micromanage Syria's political process. So these things are not incompatible. For Turkey, PKK guys in the mountains, how they wanted to dictate a political project in Syria and beyond was the core of the problem. And now we heard Hakan Fidan the other day on Turkish TV. He said, well, now the next challenge is Iraq. For Turkey, PKK problem hasn't finished. In Iraq, what is the Iraqi government gonna do, and how they're gonna deal with it? So anyway, I don't want to
Thank you.
take
We
too
have
much
3
time.
minutes.
Thank you.
Ambassador, do you want to get your 1 minute?
You skipped a question on Afrin.
Yeah, Afrin. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
not on purpose.
Just-
Kilic
just-
was looking at me
Yeah,
really well.
I was trying to.
Turkey continues to hold several regions. I think that's going, and they are having talks about having military presence, training agreements, military agreements. Now we are going to talk about agreements between two states, not just unilateral Turkish involvement trying to protect its own national security concerns. I think that's going to be healthier. If the Damascus government, theoretically, they say you need to leave Afrin, I think they'll talk and they will leave. It's not like they won't. It's just, this is now between two different governments, between Ankara and Damascus, I think.
He got
US
30
troops.
seconds of you, so you
U.S. troops. I could be accused of always coming up with another reason to keep U.S. troops anywhere in the 80 places they are around the world with some truth. But on this one, I think the ISIS mission with Damascus we can do without having a presence on the ground for any particular duration in the Northeast. However, for the moment, until we see that the 29 January agreement is being carried out, U.S. troops on the ground, I think, are essential for all sides to play nice with each other. The other thing is, there are three, we just alluded to that, there are three other outside countries that have troops in Syria. Let's name them, folks. Turkey, Russia. And I'm kind of reluctant for us to pull our troops out as long as everybody else is there. I think it's better to do kind of a deal and negotiate.
2 quick points. One, the issue raised about societal differences. I think this really highlights the need for vigorous transitional justice mechanisms that address and look at accountability issues, certainly from the Assad regime era and going forward, but also have a real focus on reconciliation and healing. This is a country that has been through not just 15 years of civil war, but nearly 5 decades of authoritarian rule. On the US question, I would agree with Jim. I would put forth the idea, something that I'm toying with, of a Lebanon-style mechanism, one that we see right now in Lebanon that is headed by CENTCOM, that is working on monitoring and implementing the very shaky ceasefire there. That kind of mechanism could work quite well in Syria, given CENTCOM's deep ties both to the Kurdish side and now to the transition government. It doesn't need to be an enormous expenditure of US resources, nor does it require a major footprint. It could be Damascus-based. And actually, Charles's comments about Israel and intelligence sharing and this fusion cell that's set up, this Syria mechanism for could also play a role in that regard as well. Thank you.
I think the integration question is the key one, but there's no easy answer for it. I don't think there is a single decision or a single policy or a single announcement that Damascus could make that will magically fix this. I think time is the ingredient that people need the most. Time, exchange, not having lines drawn on the map helps a lot. When you have a line on the map, you don't have the exchange to be able to build bridges. To give you a really simplistic anecdote, when I first went into Syria after Assad's fall, one of the places I spent time in was Latakia and Tartus. And in both places, we put together workshops with local civil society. And in the one in Latakia, we made a point of inviting people from Idlib to come and join. And when the tent cards went up around the table, it was a very awkward moment, frankly, for me, watching, activists in Latakia having to sit next to men from Idlib who were also civil society activists. And for about the first half of the meeting, they wouldn't even look at each other, let alone address each other's views on experiences from the last 13 years. But then someone made a joke about somebody's beard. A woman made a joke about one of the men's beards, and he could have taken it as an insult, but he laughed, and it completely broke the tension in the room. And by the end of it, women, men, women, and women were exchanging cell phone numbers, and their specific civil society organizations exchanging their plans for exchanges like this. And so on a really simplistic level, just getting people together across lines that have been drawn on the map for a really long time helps too. Because ultimately, everyone in Syria wants the same thing, which is to put the conflict behind them and to move on. And all of the politics will continue to be politics. And ultimately, I still think almost all of the big sources of potential conflict in Syria are all about politics. It's not about religion, it's about politics. And Syria is in a prolonged transition phase. So we're not going to have a clear answer to any of these questions. The constitution was made very clear from early on that there was not going to be a rapid constitutional reform process. So the best we're going to get on anything at this point is a presidential decree, and trust that throughout this transitional process, as trust continues to rebuild, as more people will be involved in that process, those decrees will turn into constitutional reforms. But ultimately, the only way you can build trust is by human-to-human exchange. And we're really early in this for the Northeast. But I think if there's anything to be shown of the video clips of, senior SDF figures kissing their compatriots on the cheeks when 2 weeks earlier they were willing to kill each other, is an encouraging sign. And if that continues to melt down, all the better. But it's early days. And just really quickly on the US military withdrawal. I think what we're seeing right now, well, I know what we're seeing right now is a conditions-based drawdown. Not a total withdrawal, but there is a drawdown underway, and it's not just Al Tanf. Kasrak, Karabalgia air bases are already being reduced as we speak and have been for at least the last 5 or 6 days. But it is conditions based on the integration. My understanding is we may only be a few weeks away from a presidential decision to fully withdraw. I think that would be premature. But ultimately, this is a political decision in the White House, and Donald Trump's never been wholly supportive of having troops in Syria. But now that we have a government in Damascus whose president has been in the Oval Office and President Trump seems to really like, and we have ongoing efforts by the US and Syria together in Damascus to find the location for a military and intelligence compound and to reestablish a permanent diplomatic presence. And those efforts are ongoing, notwithstanding the threats. And actually the Iranian threat is considered more severe potentially to that decision than an ISIS one, rightly or wrongly. But that process is underway. So my take on this is, A, it's inevitable. When Assad fell and the SDF hopefully fully integrates, there is no need for US military bases in northeastern Syria, but there will still be a need for the US military and the intelligence community and the government to work in Damascus with the government and with actors across Syria. But that will be focused from Damascus. It won't be having military outposts in the desert here, there, or anywhere, because those days are gone.
Everybody's cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously optimistic.
Yeah.
I'm much more optimistic than I was 3 weeks ago.
Thank you very much. And there is, it is very, probably the Shara government, the Syrian people and the Syrian government will have a very important mission in the next couple of years. It will be a test for reconciliation of different sectarian groups, reconciliation of different ethnic groups, reconciliation of the interest of different regional actors. So Syria will be a significant test for the stability of the region. And I can see that everybody is Europeans, Americans, the people, the leaders in the Middle East are all hoping that Shara will be successful, but it also puts a lot of pressure and rising expectations on him. So we will continue to have these debates probably in the next couple of years. Hopefully, now our level of optimism will increase in every meeting. I want to thank for our panelists and thank you for joining us. Please join us to thank for our panelists for this debate.